Take a poll of parents. How many of them would say that their kids are beautiful? I'd be willing to bet that the response would be nearly 100%. But one nanny state politician in the UK thinks that telling your kids that they are beautiful or to comment on their appearance at all will potentially destroy their little egos. The theory from Liberal Democrat Joe Swinson, the country's women's minister. Swinson made the declaration before a progress report on the government's body confidence campaign, which aims to, quote, raise awareness of the positive and negative portrayals of bodies in the media and to find ways of building self-esteem among young people. And so to avoid giving your daughter a complex, you must never comment on their appearance. Ms. Swinson, who is not actually a parent, also urged dads not to compliment mums in front of their kids. Are there any pearls of wisdom in what this co-parent has to say? For more, we turn to Sun News Atlantic Bureau Chief Kris Sims. Kris, bad thing to tell your daughter that she's got a nice dress on today?
Only according to this lady who, as you point out, isn't a parent. And to be very generous, most of the commenters or those who follow what we call the nanny state or the culture wars would maybe allow her to say this very silly thing because she's a non-parent. Maybe it's one of those statements that if and when she ever does become a mother or a parent in that sort of way, it's one of those things she goes, oh, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I told parents, which is usually the first things out of their mouths is, hi, beautiful, that they shouldn't say that because they're going to give their child a complex. It's, you know, quite typically you can finish the sentence. A sentence that starts like, government ministers tells parents they should probably just stop. Quit reading, just stop. And that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it's none of their business. Other than, you know, the actual safety and health of children, you know, how you actually parent is none of the state's business. But mostly, this is what I find just bizarre with this disconnect. A parent who is reading the Times or the Telegraph on what the Minister of Women has to say about parenting is going to be a plugged-in parent. They don't need advice from a pointy head in London on how to raise their children. If you are a dirtbag and you are only focusing on your child's appearance and putting them in pageants and giving them complexes, you probably don't know that you have a federal government, let alone a Minister of Women's issues. So the crowd she is speaking to is already conscientious, plugged in, educated, and aware. Of course, and she even goes on to say, this is what I found really insulting, make sure you compliment their cleverness if they construct a jigsaw puzzle. Oh, really? We're supposed to praise our children. Thank you. I didn't know that until I read this in the newspaper coming from a minister. I didn't know you were supposed to praise your child for being clever or for being curious or for being athletic or for being kind or for being generous. And again, I think this is one of those moments where she'd better hope that it's one of those things that she says as a non-parent and that she regrets later after becoming a parent, realizing just how all-encompassing one's love is for their children and how, frankly, you don't need the government telling you how to do it.
Now, the UK minister says she is an aunt, though, and she actually catches herself sometimes, you know, telling her niece that, you know, you look beautiful today, and boy, you know, is that ever wrong?
I wonder what her brother or sister, whoever actually is the parent of the child, thinks of this, that Aunt Jo is coming over and is biting her tongue every time she spontaneously and naturally wants to compliment her niece or her nephew. That is a normal thing. To say, oh, you look wonderful, or wow, that looks snazzy on you, or you look great, hi, beautiful, hey, pretty thing. That is a normal, loving, caring, nurturing thing to say to your children. The fact that we need to say this out loud is a little bit of a head scratcher. Again, anybody who is reading up on what a minister has to say, they're going to be a thorough and engaged parent. Somebody who, and she goes on to say in the article, oh, I'm not saying that you can never comment on their appearance, but make sure you don't focus on it solely. Anybody who focuses solely on their child's appearance, whether you're one of those rare freakish people who is injecting their son with steroids or making them into a bodybuilder of some sort, or focusing only on their daughter being in some sort of a pageant, they're not going to even hear that message coming from government. It doesn't matter. Those people who are actually reading up on the minutes of some minister's presentation, they don't need that kind of advice.
And she also talks about you shouldn't make any comments about your wife's appearance in front of your kids. That's apparently a taboo as well. Honey, you look nice tonight. You shouldn't say that.
That actually goes against, and again, I'm all for reading up on people who have very thoughtfully thought these things through. And people who have very thoughtfully thought these things through are often excellent book writers on theories of parenting and methods of parenting. Those are good things to read. It helps you consider things that you might not have considered before. But they're more, in-depth psychological sort of things. And one of those psychological sort of things is make sure to compliment and love your spouse. Whether it's your wife or your husband, make sure that the children see you being nurturing and open and complimentary towards your husband or your wife. Make sure you let them see affection. And for her to say, make sure that the husband doesn't compliment the wife, the mom, in front of the kids, like, that's crazy. That is actually a building block of one's self-esteem. They often say that daughters will marry men who have been similar to their fathers, and that vice versa for sons. And so in that case, you want to make sure that you are an excellent role model. I think, again, this can be chalked up to somebody who hasn't had this kind of experience and hasn't really thought it through, which is kind of frightening for a minister of women's issues. Women's issues often revolves around things like this. And for her to say something that sounds so tone deaf, according to the articles I read on it, it's a bit disheartening.
In Ontario, now they're talking about, just to switch gears for a second, the
Sure.
Ontario government wants corporations in that province to start instituting some type of gender equity targets because they're saying that Canadian companies are falling way behind other countries in gender equity on the boards of corporations and in senior positions in large corporations. And so for all the companies that trade publicly on the stock market, they want them to bring in these new measures. Is this really going to do anything to have targets for gender equity?
I also find that a bit surprising. And reading up in some of the business pages reacting to this, they are really quite surprised that something so arbitrary would be dreamed up by the government and then applied to their own personal private company. Now, when you're in the public sector, of course, you are trying to represent the public as a whole. So at least, most people, I think, can understand that they would want to have some sort of target as to how many men they will hire, how many women they hire, from what background they're hired from, that sort of thing. Because, the government is us. We are the state. So in order to get a job with the state, they probably wanted to make a bit more representative. But to actually demand that a private company hire people and put them on the corporate board according to what a government says so, that's pretty heavy-handed. And also, I found it interesting that she said, well, it's not a quota, it's a target. Well, that's just another word for it. If you're giving them a target and then calling them to the carpet when they aren't reaching that target that you as a government have assigned to them as a private company, that is a quota. If you don't want to call it that, I mean, that's her choice. That's a bit of wordplay, but it's still a quota. And again, it's a bit surprising. I'm sure there are companies and industries that are dominated by women. I know they're still paid publicly, but for example, nurses. Are we going to stop funding nurses or have men protest out in front of the nurses union stations until it's a 50-50% equality between men and women who choose to become a nurse? What if it's a very highly specialized computer engineering firm, which, again, there are lots of women who are awesome at that, but perhaps it's not exactly 50-50 when you break it down. Are you going to sit there and wait and not progress until you manage to get 50% of women sitting on their board? It just seems a bit arbitrary coming from government when applied to the private sector.
Now, the Ontario government says, look, we've achieved this in the public sector. We have gender equality in government boards and commissions, and if we can do it, the private sector should be able to do it too. But I mean, in reality, it's apples and oranges, because I mean, we're talking about partisan political appointments to boards and commissions of government. I mean, they can appoint anybody they want, and whether people are qualified for the jobs or not really doesn't matter. I mean, we all know that they appoint people who are friends of the government or who support their party.
You could approach that in that way too. Yeah, you could look at it that way and say, you know what, it's up to the government in those public sector boards to appoint people. So you can sit there and, like you say, and some other commentators also say, they question their qualifications anyway. So in that vein, you could say, yeah, you can pick and choose 50-50 or 70-30 or whatever you choose anyway. But I think most importantly, those public boards are paid by the state. So the idea of making them equitable, I think anyway, and other people do as well, I imagine, that if you try to make them more equitable or more representative of the actual Canadian population or the Ontario population in this case, that's more understandable. But a private company, a seller of widgets, ABC widgets, needs to have 50-50? Why? Why is that up to the government in that case? So what if they just don't have that many women within their board or within their company just by happenstance? What if they're a smaller company and they started out as a family company? A bunch of brothers got together and started some ski-doo company. Are they supposed to wait until they get 50% of women coming into their workforce in order to put them up on boards? Again, it's the idea of equality is just, well, it's foundational. It's important, of course, but to just arbitrarily tell a private company, you got to have 50-50 on the corporate board or we're going to what, fine you, criticize you,
absolutely.
pull you in front of a committee, you know.
It's ridiculous. Kris, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.